I was 22 at the time. The Yuexhen Group was not yet mine. To be precise, back then, I didn't even have true freedom over the name Daniel. My father was critically ill. Third uncle had already joined forces with 4 directors to openly question father's management decisions during internal meetings. Second uncle appeared neutral on the surface, but was secretly reaching out to private equity funds. Every day, new people defected in the boardroom, new probes were made within the company, and it was no different at the hospital. Father lay in his hospital bed. Chemotherapy had made his voice hoarse, yet his eyes remained sharp. Whenever he was lucid, his first words were always, "The group must not fall into your third uncle's hands." His second sentence was, "You are still too young. Don't let them see that you are afraid." During that time, I spent every day either handling company affairs or keeping vigil at the hospital. At the age of 22, I learned ahead of time the things adults least want to learn: suspicion, defensiveness, silence, and disappointment. I even learned how to digest all the bad news alone in the dead of night, and then walk into the meeting room the next morning with an unchanged expression. That night, my father had just finished a round of treatment. After nearly half an hour of violent coughing, he finally fell asleep under the influence of sedatives and painkillers. I walked out of the ward, skipped the elevator, and climbed up the fire stairs floor by floor until I pushed open the door to the rooftop. The wind was strong, carrying the damp chill peculiar to late autumn in the south. I stood by the railing and unlocked my phone. The 2 messages lighting up the screen pierced my eyes like ice picks. One came from the attending physician. "The cancer cells are spreading faster than expected. The family needs to be mentally prepared." Another message from my assistant. "At this afternoon's emergency board meeting, 2 more directors publicly expressed their support for third uncle's proposal. One of them is your father's former subordinate." I stared at those 2 messages for a long time, long enough for the screen to go dark automatically, reflecting my own face. In that moment, for the first time, a very absurd thought crossed my mind. If I just gave up everything, would it be easier? Footsteps suddenly came from behind, very light, as if afraid of disturbing something. I turned around. A girl was holding onto the wall, slowly walking out from the rooftop entrance. Her eyes were covered with white gauze, and she held a white cane in her hand, the tip probing the ground ahead. She clearly didn't know anyone was there until a gust of wind messed up her hair. She stopped and listened for a few seconds. "Is anyone there?" I didn't answer. She stood in place, tapping the ground lightly with her cane. The wind blew the stray hair by her ear, and she tilted her head slightly, as if trying to discern the direction of the wind, or perhaps the direction of my breathing. A few seconds later, she asked softly, "If someone else were here, would you be unhappy too?" I frowned slightly. "How did you know?" She gave a faint smile, her voice very soft. "Your breathing, it's erratic, and a bit heavy, as if something is weighing on you." For the first time, I felt that someone I couldn't see could see through me more easily than many people I could see. She didn't wait for my response. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a candy. Its wrapper was pale blue, glinting faintly in the moonlight. She held her hand out to me. "Here." I didn't take it. "I don't eat candy." "Then keep it." "Why?" She thought for a moment, then answered earnestly, "Because right now, I don't have anything else to give you." I looked at the candy. Her hand holding it was very thin, with distinct knuckles, yet it held a strange certainty. She didn't rush me, nor did she pull it back. She simply held her hand out quietly, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. In the end, I took it. The candy was small, and as it lay in my palm, it carried a trace of the lingering warmth from her pocket. She seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, the corners of her mouth curving slightly upward. Then, supporting herself against the wall, she began to make her way back tentatively. Her white cane tapped out a soft rhythm in the night breeze. She took a few steps, then stopped again. Actually, not being able to see isn't that scary. I held the candy, saying nothing. She pointed at the night sky, accurately pointing in the direction of the moon. "At least I can still hear many things. Like the wind, like the leaves, like..." She paused. The breathing of someone who is clearly very sad but pretends to be fine. With that, she left. The sound of her footsteps slowly faded away in the stairwell. I stood where I was. The early autumn evening breeze slipped through my fingers, making the candy wrapper rustle softly, and gradually taking away the last trace of warmth. Later I learned that her name was Harper. That day she had just been blind for 3 months. And from that day on, I remembered her name. Later, I looked into Harper's past. She did not lose her sight due to an accident. She had suffered from a rare retinal degenerative disease since childhood. Her vision began to gradually decline after the age of 18, and by the time she was 22, the condition suddenly deteriorated sharply, eventually resulting in a complete loss of light perception. The doctor told her that there was a high-risk surgical option with a success rate of about 40%. If it failed, not only would her vision not be restored, but it could even trigger permanent nerve damage. She thought about it for a long time and ultimately refused. "I have already gotten used to the darkness," she told the doctor. "I don't want to gamble with what I have left." She accepted it. But I cannot. After that meeting on the rooftop, I started keeping a quiet eye on her. Not surveillance, just occasionally asking after her well-being. I knew she had gone to the music center for the blind, knew she had started learning the guqin again, and I also knew that to pay for tuition and living expenses, she had sold her favorite instrument. That guqin was a birthday gift her father gave her when she was 16. The body was made of old cedar wood, with a warm and mellow tone. After playing it for 6 years, every string bore the slight concave marks worn by her fingers. On the night she sold the guqin, she cried for a long time alone in her rented apartment. The next day, she went to class as usual. It was the first time I realized that when a person is truly strong, they do not keep the word strength on their lips. I bought that guqin back. Sitting in the car with the instrument case, I hesitated for a full 20 minutes, thinking of countless reasons to return it to her directly. I could say I stumbled upon it by chance, or say I was just giving it to her as a gift. But every sentence was swallowed back before it could leave my mouth, because I was afraid she would ask why, and even more afraid that she would refuse. Ultimately, I chose the most roundabout way. Through a public welfare music organization, I returned the piano to her under the guise of long-term borrowing. The first time she held that violin, she touched a faint scratch on its body, the one she had accidentally made when she was 16, and suddenly froze. She asked the staff member at the organization, "Why is someone suddenly willing to help me?" Following my instructions, the staff member replied, "Perhaps it's because someone believes in you." She remained silent for a long time, then, clutching the recovered violin, sat alone in the rehearsal room and cried. I stood at the corner at the end of the corridor and did not go in. That was the first time I felt that some feelings of affection don't necessarily have to be known to the other person. Later, she participated in her first public performance. I went and sat in the last row. She couldn't see me and I didn't tell her. Halfway through the performance, she played a wrong note. It was a very small mistake, but she was clearly affected. The next 2 movements were noticeably much stiffer. Afterward, she didn't celebrate. She sat alone backstage, the instrument case resting on her knees, her fingertips repeatedly stroking the strings. I didn't go in. I simply asked a staff member to pass on a note with only 1 sentence. "You didn't play a wrong note just now. You were just too afraid of playing a wrong note." After hearing the contents of the note, she remained silent for a long time, and then suddenly smiled. That year, the hesitation in her music began to fade away bit by bit. From the very first note, her back started to straighten, like a small sapling standing tall again after being soaked by rain. She entered more and more competitions and gave more and more performances, and her name began to be mentioned by more and more people in small circles. And I still sat in the last row. Once, twice, 10 times, 1 year, 2 years, until 7 years. She never knew. Every time the applause rang out, there was always someone who applauded earlier than anyone else. 7 years later, the Yuexhen Group was completely in my hands. After my father passed away from illness, I spent 3 years clearing the board. My third uncle was forced to step down, my second uncle voluntarily handed over his shares, and several people who had once tried to force me to step aside lost their influence one by one. At the age of 25, I officially took over as chairman. That year I was 27. Since then, everyone knew the name Daniel. Calm, dominant, and reserved, never showing mercy at the negotiating table. Some in the circle commented that Daniel was like a machine, with no weaknesses, no flaws, hiding even his joys and sorrows completely. No one knows that I have always remembered a girl. Her name is Harper. So when my mother suggested a blind date for the first time, I didn't refuse. She had already braced herself for being interrupted. So she clearly froze for a moment when I said, "Okay. Who is it?" I asked. Mother scrolled through the notes on her phone. "Harper, a guqin player." "Oh right. Her eyesight is poor. She can't see." The fountain pen in my hand stopped. The tip blotted a small pool of ink on the document. It was a long time before I said, "I have." Mother looked up at me. "You know him?" "I know a name." "What do you mean?" "Nothing." I didn't explain, because I suddenly felt that after waiting 7 years, I had finally found an opportunity. I changed out of my usual custom suit and dug a plain cotton shirt from the corner of the wardrobe. I also switched to an ordinary business car. My assistant stood by watching me do all this, and finally couldn't help but speak. "Mr. Daniel, are you really going to do this? Why not just tell her who you are?" I looked out the window and fell silent for a few seconds. She hates it when people pity her for her blindness, and she hates the ways of the wealthy circle. But I want her to meet Daniel first. I fastened my cufflinks and turned to look at him. Not Daniel of the Yuexhen Group. In the cafe. She sat by the window, a glass of warm water in front of her. Compared to 7 years ago, she had matured a little. Her hair had grown much longer, loosely draped over her shoulders, and her face was a bit thinner than in my memory. But her posture was just the same. Back straight, head slightly tilted, as if catching every sound around her. She heard footsteps and turned her face precisely in my direction. "Mr. Daniel?" "Yes." "Hello." "Hello." I sat down across from her. Her fingers rested lightly on the rim of the cup, slowly tracing circles around the edge. It was a habit of hers when she was thinking. 7 years ago, when she played the piano and thought, she would also unconsciously stroke the strings like that. I remember. "What do you do for work?" she asked. "Company employee." "What company?" "The Deeper." She nodded. "And the position?" "Middle management." I quoted the annual salary figure for a mid-level group executive. She visibly relaxed. Her shoulders eased half an inch, and her fingertips dropped from the rim of the cup to the table. She said, "That's good." "Why?" She was quiet for a few seconds. "Because I don't really like people who are too rich." "Why?" She lowered her head and stirred her coffee. "Because I can't see." Many wealthy people, when they encounter someone like me, subconsciously feel they can make decisions for me. They think they see things more clearly, so they are more right. I don't like that feeling. I looked at her, my fingers tightening slightly beneath the table. What if I were just an ordinary person? Not a lot of money, an ordinary job, an ordinary life. Would you be willing to be with someone like that? She thought for a moment. The cafe lights fell on her eyelashes, casting a small shadow. "We can try." A faint flutter rose in my heart. 7 years. This was the sentence I had been waiting for. Over the next month, we met 13 times. The first time we had dinner, she avoided ordering anything that required deboning or peeling. Noticing this detail, I silently removed every bone from the steamed sea base in front of her. The second time we went to a bookstore, I tore off the plastic wrap on the back cover before she could reach for a book. The third time, at a concert featuring Debussy, she leaned on my shoulder and fell asleep as she listened. I sat motionless for 40 minutes. The fourth time, strolling through a vegetable market, I instinctively brushed aside the top tomato, which had been crushed soft, just as she reached out to pick one. Bit by bit, she began to realize that this self-proclaimed ordinary employee seemed somewhat different. I could cook, play the piano, and had an astonishingly good memory. I could even remember exactly how many ice cubes she wanted in her coffee. Once, she suddenly turned and asked me, "Daniel, have we met before?" My hand holding the coffee cup tightened slightly. "Why do you ask?" "Your voice," she said softly, "sounds familiar. Maybe you're mistaken." I smiled. She didn't press further, but I noticed her fingertips lingered on the rim of the cup for a long time, as if trying to untie a very complicated knot. It was raining that day. We walked out of the restaurant and stood at the entrance waiting for a car. The rain was heavy, splashing onto the steps. She suddenly reached out. "Give it to me." "What?" "Hand." I paused for a moment. She said, "The road is slippery in the rain. I can't see where the puddles are." I handed over my hand. She held my wrist very lightly, but my breath still caught for half a beat. 7 years ago, she gave me a candy. 7 years later, for the first time, she took the initiative to hold my hand. At that moment, I suddenly realized that I might have actually waited for it. 6 months later, she returned from the music room, placed her instrument case in the entryway, and suddenly said, "Daniel, have you ever considered getting married?" I was bringing the heated soup out of the kitchen when I heard this and stopped by the dining table. "Yes," I said. She smiled, turning her face slightly towards me. "Then are you willing?" "I am." "Then let's get married." There was no grand wedding, no media, no lavish banquet. We didn't even inform too many people. We simply obtained a marriage certificate. When we walked out of the Civil Affairs Bureau, the weather was beautiful. She stood on the steps, tilted her face back, and sunlight fell on her eyelashes. She asked me, "Are you nervous?" "A little." I was telling the truth. When signing, I held the pen and paused for about 5 seconds before writing my name. She smiled. "Me too." My palms were sweating when I signed. I took her hand. "Then you'll get used to it gradually." I didn't take her to live in a private estate. Instead, I bought a quiet 3-bedroom apartment. When she walked in for the first time, she ran her hand along the wall, then turned around and smiled. "It's quite comfortable, just feels especially empty." Of course it was empty, because I had removed all 7 originally assigned servants in advance. Not because I suddenly loved an ordinary life, but because I knew she didn't like strangers touching her things, and she needed her own space. I would rather do it myself. In the 2nd month of our marriage, I felt the pressure of hiding the truth for the first time. That day, I was driving her to the music store. Just after I parked the car, someone suddenly walked over quickly from a distance. It was a deputy general manager from one of the group's branch companies. President Daniel. He saw Harper, and his expression changed instantly. He corrected himself stiffly. "Mr. Daniel." Harper didn't speak. She only spoke after getting in the car. "Why did that person just call you President Daniel?" "Slip of the tongue." "Do people at your company tend to misspeak?" I gripped the steering wheel. "Occasionally." She was quiet for a couple of seconds. "Your breathing has slowed down." I didn't say anything. She added, "You're lying." In that moment, I suddenly felt that I might not be able to deceive her for much longer. But she didn't press further. She simply turned her head, the corner of her mouth carrying an indescribable curve. "But I don't want to expose you right now." "Why?" "I want to see," she said, "how long you plan to deceive me." From that day on, I began to feel that she was like a keen cat, circling silently around me. The second slip-up occurred a month later. That day, the music store was short a pianist. The manager, sweating profusely, found me waiting in the break area and lowered his voice. "Mr. Daniel, could I trouble you to fill in? Just for 20 minutes. Before I could speak, Harper asked from the side, "What's wrong?" "Nothing," I said. She turned her face away. "Can you play the piano?" I remained silent. She smiled and said softly, "I could tell." In the end, I sat down at the piano. I played an old tune, very quiet, very slow. It was Remembering Old Friends, a piece I had practiced many times in my youth, and my fingering had my own habits. Before the third to last phrase, I habitually paused for half a beat. When the music ended, The entire music shop remained quiet for 2 or 3 seconds. Harper sat in the audience, motionless for a long time. After a long while, she finally said softly, "This piece, I've heard it somewhere." My heart tightened. "Where?" "Before," she said, her voice very soft. "During the first 2 years after I went blind, I would receive a recording every month from an anonymous pianist. It was always just that one song. I never knew who it was." She paused and tilted her head slightly. "But the one you just played is a bit different from those recordings. In the recordings, the half-beat pause is between the 4th and 5th lines. The pause you just made was before the 3rd-to-last line." I remained silent for a full 3 seconds. She was even more meticulous than I had thought. "Maybe I got it mixed up," she said, with no disappointment in her tone, but rather an indescribable quality. "But I haven't heard this piece itself in a long time. Thank you." On the way home that day, she suddenly asked, "Daniel, did you used to practice the piano a lot?" "I studied it for a few years when I was a child. And then, later on, I got busy, so I stopped playing." She nodded and didn't ask any further. But I knew what she was thinking. An ordinary middle manager who learned the instrument for a few years as a child. How could he play such an obscure 7-year-old guqin piece so completely? The third slip-up was on a weekend evening. I was cooking in the kitchen when she dug out an old book from the study. On the title page were a date and a signature I had casually written. She felt the indentation of the handwriting and paused for a long time. "Daniel, your handwriting. What's wrong?" She didn't speak. She closed the book and put it back in its place. That evening at dinner, she suddenly said, "I have a friend who works at a music center for the blind. She recently told me that the guqin sent by the charity back then was actually commissioned by an anonymous buyer." My hand, holding my serving chopsticks, paused for a moment. "Is that so?" She said that after buying the guqin, that person specifically went through a very long process, routing it through 3 organizations before sending it back. She took a sip of water. Her tone is flat, as if she were talking about someone else's business. "Tell me, who would do such a thing for a stranger? Maybe someone who truly cares." She smiled. "I think so too." She never directly called me out. But from that day on, I knew she had pieced together countless fragments in her mind. My voice, my piano playing, my handwriting, the timing of those anonymous recordings, the way the piano was returned. She was just waiting for me to speak up. And I still didn't, because I was becoming more and more afraid. Afraid that once she knew the whole truth, she would discover that the ordinary Daniel she liked never existed. The first argument wasn't about money, nor was it about anyone else. It was about the doctor. Foreign experts have sent over a new treatment plan, a significant improvement over the technology from 7 years ago, but risks remain. The success rate is about 70%, and failure could result in permanent nerve damage. I didn't tell her. Instead, I contacted the hospital privately and arranged for a full set of tests. She found out anyway. That night she sat on the sofa, quiet as a statue. "You saw a doctor?" Her voice was flat. I stopped peeling the apple. "Yeah. Why didn't you tell me?" "I want to confirm it first, and then I'll tell you after I've confirmed." "And then? What then? After you confirm? What will you do?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. She turned her head. Although she couldn't see, her gaze landed precisely in my direction. "Daniel, do you also think that just because I can't see, you should be the one making all the decisions?" "No." I frowned. "Then why are you doing this?" I didn't answer. She continued speaking, her voice not loud, but every word was clear. "I don't need you to live my life for me." That sentence left me stunned for a long time, because I suddenly realized that I had been protecting her in my own way, without noticing that this protection had slowly turned into a form of control. I was using my definition of "for her own good" to override her own right to choose. That night I didn't explain. I lay in the study, sleepless until 3 in the morning, repeatedly replaying the expression on her face when she spoke. It wasn't the examination she cared about, but that I had placed her life on the operating table without ever asking her wishes. The next morning, I placed all the examination materials in front of her. "You decide for yourself," I said. She felt the thickness of the document and fell silent for a moment. "You don't object? I'll be afraid. But I won't decide for you." She was quiet for a moment, then reached out, found my fingers, and held them gently. "Thank you." I smiled. "It's what I should do." From that day on, I learned to take half a step back and let her make her own decisions. And she learned to tell me proactively when she needed to, "Daniel, I need you." During those 2 weeks, she listened to the medical report over and over again. Once, I went to the music room to pick her up. When I pushed the door open, she wasn't practicing. She was just sitting in front of the guqin, her fingers resting on the strings, motionless. I walked over. She heard my footsteps but didn't turn around. When I first learned to play the piano as a child, my teacher told me that the strings shouldn't be too tight or too loose. If they're too tight, they'll snap. If they're too loose, the sound will scatter. She plucked a string under her fingertips, and a low hum slowly spread through the room. Right now, I'm wondering if I'm too tight or too loose. I crouched down, gently took her hand from the strings, and clasped it in my own palm. "You don't have to choose." "What do you mean?" "It's okay not to have the surgery. We've been living well, just as we are." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said softly, "But what if I could see you? I am right in front of you now." "It's different," she said, her voice a little hoarse. "I want to see what the person on the rooftop 7 years ago actually looked like." That was the first time I heard the word rooftop from her lips. I froze completely. "You remember?" "I remember the footsteps." She turned her face toward me. 7 years. And I still remember. That night, she finally said, "Okay, I'll do it." Greater trouble lay ahead. Yuexhen Group was preparing to enter the accessible culture industry, with the core project being the establishment of a national art education system for the visually impaired, and Harper serving as a consultant. Once the project succeeded, Yuexhen would occupy a pivotal position in the new industry. This incident attracted a person, Matthew, managing director of Shanghua Capital. When we met for the first time, he said to me with a smile, "Mr. Daniel, things really are different after getting married." "How so?" "Before, you had no weaknesses." I looked at him. "You're wrong." "What?" "She isn't my weakness. She is something I'm willing to protect." Matthew smiled. "Then let's see if you can protect her." 3 days later, malicious news broke out. Blind guqin player marries into a wealthy family. Yuexhen Group suspected of using disabled people to package corporate image. Inside story of a wealthy family's charitable marriage. Videos, articles, and comments spread rapidly. Some flooded the comments section of her performance videos with abuse, while others dug up her family background to make malicious speculations. I wanted to handle it immediately. Harper stopped me. "Let me do it myself." I looked at her. "Are you sure? Are you sure? I don't want to hide behind you." Harper began investigating on her own. She listened to that surreptitiously filmed video many times. Suddenly, she said, "There's a problem here." "Where?" "The background noise. I'm not sure exactly where, but I've heard this echo before. There's also a very low mechanical sound, like a large air conditioning compressor." I immediately had the team investigate. We eventually traced it to an art foundation. That foundation had recently received a massive donation from Shanghua Capital. As the investigation deepened, we discovered that someone used insiders within the foundation to gain early access to project materials, then released them simultaneously through several social media accounts. The goal wasn't to destroy Harper personally. It was to manufacture public opinion to make investors doubt the Yuexhen Group's project, and force a few wavering directors to sell their shares before the stock price fell. The last line of the investigation report listed an account. I opened it, and my expression darkened bit by bit. The ultimate beneficiary of that account was my third uncle, whom I had expelled from the group 7 years ago. He never gave up. 7 years ago, he forced my father to relinquish control through the board of directors. After failing, he withdrew publicly but secretly allied with Matthew, waiting for an opportunity to strike back. This time, Harper was the best opening they found. I didn't tell her all the details. She figured it out. Is there something else? I remained silent. She said softly, Daniel, what was your biggest flaw in the past? What? I want to shoulder everything myself. She took my hand. This time, let me be with you. I remained silent for a long time, finally nodding. Okay. I looked into Matthew's background through private channels. Shenghua Capital's cash flow hasn't been optimistic in the past 2 years. He is desperate to secure this project not only to expand his territory, but also to fill the gap left by the failure of his last round of investment. And his collaboration with my third uncle began 5 years ago during a private equity financing. My third uncle used his remaining connections to pull strings for him, and in return we have today's joint counterattack. In other words, Matthew didn't want to destroy Harper. What he needed was for the Yuexhen project to collapse, causing the group's stock price to fluctuate before the bidding. Once shareholder confidence was shaken, his third uncle behind the scenes would have the opportunity to intervene again. On the final day of the bidding, Shenghua Capital submitted a proposal that appeared flawless. The data was comprehensive, and the team was impressive. Almost everyone believed that Yuexhen was bound to lose. But Harper discovered an anomaly. The project promotional recording submitted by the other party was inconsistent with the public speech version. This person has a very fixed habit when speaking, she said. He pauses twice in the middle of every paragraph. But this recording doesn't. The technical team re-examined it. Sure enough, the recording had been edited. The deleted parts involved the source of the core data. Upon re-verification, it was discovered that there were significant issues with the data provided by Shenghua Capital. At the on-site inquiry meeting, I placed all the evidence on the table. If Shenghua Capital believes there is nothing wrong with this data, please explain why the original records are inconsistent with the version you submitted. The conference room fell silent. Matthew did not answer. In the end, Yuexhen Group won the project. After the meeting, as he passed by me, he whispered, I lost. Yeah. I didn't lose to you. He looked at Harper, who was waiting for me nearby. I lost to you all. But I'm not your third uncle's pawn. He set things up for me 5 years ago, and I've already paid that debt. This time, it's what I want myself. I looked at him and gave a nod. I didn't ask any further. I walked over. Harper stood there. She hadn't heard our conversation, but she smiled at me. I took her hand. After the project's success, Harper did not accept media interviews. The first thing she did was propose establishing a new music education program to help visually impaired children learn the guqin. She wrote her experiences into a curriculum, telling those children, not being able to see the world does not mean you cannot have a world of your own. I asked her how much funding she needed. She said, I have my own. I raised an eyebrow. Since when do you have that? Performance earnings. Is that enough? For now it is. I smiled. Then I'll invest. She shook her head. I don't want your money. Why? Because I want to prove that I can. I looked at her and didn't insist. Okay. Later she actually did it. 1 music classroom in the first year, 5 in the second, and by the third year, her project began to receive support from more organizations. I only appeared when she needed me. If she lacked a venue, I made the contacts. If she needed a legal team, I provided the resources. But the final decision was always in her hands. Once, she said with a smile, Daniel, you're becoming more and more like a normal husband. I asked, he didn't look like that before? Before, he looked like a chairman. I smiled. And now, she tilted her head, smiling smugly. Now, he looks like my husband. At that moment, I felt that this title sounded much better than chairman. Foreign experts reached out again. The new technical solution carries significantly lower risks than it did 7 years ago, but the risk still remains, with a success rate of about 70%. If it fails, it could result in permanent nerve damage. Harper hesitated for a full 2 weeks. One evening, she suddenly asked me, what if it fails? Then we let it fail. Will you be disappointed? No. Why? I looked at her. Because I married you, not your eyes. I've stood by the unseen Harper for 7 years, and I'll stand by the visible Harper just the same. She fell silent, her eyes slowly reddening. What if I never see again? Then I'll stay with you for a lifetime. What if I can see? Then I'll watch with you. She finally smiled. Okay, I'll do it. After the surgery, she did not recover immediately. The doctor said it would take time. At first, she could only perceive a blur of light. Later, she began to distinguish colors, and eventually, she could see outlines clearly. I was in no rush to show myself. Until one afternoon, the nurse told me, "She can try looking at people now." I stood at the door, not going in. Harper suddenly turned her head, facing precisely toward the doorway. "Daniel." I froze. "How did you know it was me?" She smiled. "Your footsteps. You walk half a beat slower than most people. I noticed it 7 years ago on the rooftop." I walked slowly toward her. She looked at me. At first, just a blurry outline. Then bit by bit it became clear. Eyebrows, eyes, the bridge of the nose, lips. She stared at me for a long time, so long that my palms began to sweat. Then she suddenly said, "You are the person from the rooftop 7 years ago." Her voice was soft, but as certain as if she were stating a fact she had long known the answer to. I opened my mouth, but not a single word came out. She reached out, her fingertips tracing the ridge of my brow, the bridge of my nose, my jawline, before coming to rest on the corner of my mouth. "It really is you. You guessed it a long time ago?" "I guessed part of it," she said, the rims of her eyes slowly reddening. "Your footsteps, your breathing, the sound of your zither. I've been piecing it together all along, but I didn't dare be completely certain, because if I was wrong, it would be terribly embarrassing. And now," she smiled, tears hanging from the corners of her eyes. "Now I'm certain. So this is what you look like." I smiled. "Disappointed?" She shook her head. "No." "Then what does it feel like?" She thought for a moment and said seriously, "It looks better than it sounds." I didn't know how to respond for the first time. She laughed even harder. "You're blushing."
No.
"You're lying. Your ears are red too." I lowered my head. "Yeah." She reached out again, gently touching my face. Her fingertips slid from my brow bone to my jaw. This time, she no longer needed to rely on her voice to confirm where I was. She finally saw it, the man by the rooftop 7 years ago, still standing before her 7 years later. After recovering, I accompanied her to many places. When she walked into the piano room for the first time again, sunlight fell upon the strings, and she stood there looking for a long time. The trees outside the window, the grain of the piano's body, her own fingers, everything held her spellbound. Then she turned to look at me and suddenly began to cry. I did not go to her, for I knew this moment belonged to her alone. After a long while, she turned and said, "Daniel, do you know what I want to see most right now?" "What?" She walked over to me and looked at me earnestly. "You. I've listened to your voice for 7 years, and now I can finally see you." I held her tight. "Then take your time and look." "Okay." She buried her face in my chest, her voice muffled. "I'll look for a lifetime." Later I asked her, "Do you want to have another wedding?" She thought for a long time. "Simple. No media. No lavish banquets. Just family." On our wedding day, there were no jewels filling the room, no media cameras. I only prepared a violin. Her name was engraved on the body of the violin. When she touched the violin, she asked me, "Why are you giving me a violin?" "Because this is where our story began." "Then when does our story end?" I looked at her. "It won't end." "Why?" "Because I've already arranged the rest of my life." "What are you arranging?" "Spend it with you." She looked at me and suddenly smiled. "Daniel, this time I see you. Clearly." I held her hand. "I know." Later, Harper returned to the stage. She didn't change because she regained her sight. She still loved the guqin, still disliked luxury, and would still gently place a cup of warm water by my hand when I worked late into the night. And I didn't reduce my care just because she could see the world again. I just learned to respect, to reach out when she needed me, and to step back when she didn't. Once, after a concert ended, we walked out together as the city lights came on one by one. She suddenly stopped. "Daniel, do you remember that candy from 7 years ago?" I smiled. "I do. Was it sweet?" I thought for a moment. "I forgot the taste long ago." She frowned. "Liar. Really?" I looked down at her. "I only remember you." She was quiet for 2 seconds, then slipped her fingers into my palm. "That's good then." "Why?" She looked up and smiled earnestly. "You don't need to remember the candy anymore. I'll always buy it for you." I held her hand tight. The night breeze blew from the street corner, and from somewhere in the distance came the faint sound of a guqin from a music room. She suddenly asked, "Daniel, can you still hear my heart?" I stopped in my tracks. "Yes." "Really?" "Yeah." "Then what is it saying?" I looked at her and smiled. "I'm saying you forgot to bring your jacket again today." She paused for a moment, looking down at herself. Sure enough, she was wearing only a thin knit sweater. "You're lying." I smiled and draped my jacket over her shoulders. "Not this time." She leaned into my arms and was quiet for a while. Then she said softly, "When I couldn't see before, I always felt the world was very dark." I didn't say anything. She tightened her grip on my hand. Later I realized there was someone there all along. So it doesn't seem to matter so much whether it's dark or not. I lowered my head and kissed her forehead. 7 years ago, she stood on the rooftop and handed her only piece of candy to a stranger. Back then, she couldn't see his face, and he didn't dare tell her his name. 7 years later, she finally saw him clearly, and he no longer had to hide in the shadows where she couldn't see. She looked up at me. "Shall we go home?" I held her hand. "Let's go home." She smiled and leaned against me. This time, without the sound of footsteps, without the sound of breathing, without the sound of the zither. She knew exactly where I was, because my hand was holding hers all along.